Late at night, in a quiet Virginia town, two officers pulled over a black woman, accusing her of a crime she didn't commit. What started as a routine stop quickly escalated into something far more sinister, an orchestrated setup. But there was one thing these officers never saw coming. Their target wasn't just any woman. She was someone with the power to dismantle the very system they thought they controlled. This story unravels a shocking web of deception, corruption, and betrayal, leading to a courtroom revelation so explosive it would shake the entire police department to its core. The streets of Arlington, Virginia, were eerily silent, the flickering glow of streetlights casting long shadows on the empty sidewalks. The occasional car sped by, but for the most part, the town was asleep. Inside a sleek black SUV, Talia Porter drove through the suburban neighborhood, her grip on the steering wheel steady and relaxed. She glanced at her watch. Just past midnight. It had been a long day, but she felt a quiet sense of accomplishment. Her work in this town was almost complete, and soon she would be gone, with all the evidence she needed. As she approached a quiet intersection, she slowed, her sharp eyes catching the reflective glint of a stop sign ahead. Years of training had honed her instincts, making her hyper-aware of the smallest details. She came to a full stop, taking a deep breath before making a smooth left turn onto the next street. Then, red and blue lights flared behind her, bouncing off her rearview mirror. A siren pierced the stillness of the night. Talia didn't panic. Panic wasn't in her nature. Instead, her mind sharpened, her breathing steady. She glanced into the mirror and saw the squad car closing in, its headlights slicing through the darkness. With a practiced calm, she guided her vehicle to the side of the road, turned off the engine, and reached into her glove compartment for her license and registration. Behind her, the patrol car came to a stop, its emergency lights still flashing. Two officers stepped out, their movements slow and deliberate. The driver, a tall man with a square jaw and an air of authority, approached first. His partner, shorter and more heavily built, followed closely behind. Both wore the standard navy blue uniforms of the Arlington Police Department, their badges catching the glow of the streetlights. Talia's sharp gaze flicked to their name tags: Officer Brandon Carter, Officer Mark Sullivan. "Good evening, ma'am," Carter said, his tone laced with the kind of authority that expected immediate compliance. He leaned down, shining his flashlight into her car. The officer's flashlight swept across Talia's face and the interior of her car, his expression unreadable. "Do you know why I pulled you over tonight?" he asked, his tone carrying an air of authority. Talia met his gaze without hesitation, keeping her expression composed. "No, officer," she replied evenly. "I wasn't speeding, and I came to a complete stop at the intersection." A smirk tugged at the corners of Officer Carter's lips, a flicker of condescension in his eyes. "Actually, you failed to stop back there," he said smoothly. "That's a moving violation." Talia's brow furrowed slightly, though her demeanor remained calm. "I'm certain I stopped," she said, her tone steady but firm. "Perhaps you—" "License and registration," Carter interrupted sharply, his voice leaving no room for argument. Without hesitation, Talia retrieved the requested documents, her movements slow and deliberate, calculated. She had no intention of escalating the situation unnecessarily. Carter took her license, his eyes scanning the details carefully. She could feel the weight of his scrutiny as he muttered, almost to himself, "Virginia plates, local address." Then looking up, he asked, "You live around here?" Talia nodded. "Yes, officer." Before another word could be exchanged, his partner, Officer Sullivan, who had been lingering near the back of her vehicle, suddenly called out, "Hey, Carter, you might want to take a look at this." Carter straightened, wordlessly handing back her documents. "Stay in the car," he ordered before striding toward Sullivan, who stood near the trunk of her SUV. Talia's jaw tightened as she watched them through her side mirror. Sullivan was pointing at something, speaking in hushed tones. The two officers exchanged a look, a silent agreement, that sent a cold ripple of unease through her. Not fear, she rarely felt that. But this was an instinctual warning. A moment later, Carter returned to her window, his expression now grave. "Step out of the vehicle, ma'am." Talia tilted her head slightly, her voice as calm as ever. May I ask why, officer? Carter's reply was clipped, almost rehearsed. We have reason to believe you're in possession of illegal substances. Her eyes narrowed. Illegal substances? She repeated, her voice level. I think you're mistaken. We'll see about that, Carter said, gesturing for her to comply. By the time she stepped out, Sullivan was already at the trunk, a smug look plastered across his face. With theatrical flair, he lifted the trunk open and gestured toward a small, unmarked bag sitting conspicuously near the edge. Well, well, Sullivan said with feigned surprise. Look what we have here. A little bag of powdery goodness. Talia's gaze flicked from the bag to the officers, her expression unreadable. But inside, her mind was working at lightning speed, analyzing every detail. That bag had not been there when she left home. She was certain of it. This was a setup. Carter took a step closer, his smirk widening. Anything you want to tell us, ma'am? A subtle smile played at the edges of Talia's lips, a deliberate, calculated expression revealing neither fear nor submission. I'll reserve my comments for the appropriate setting, she said smoothly. Carter chuckled, mistaking her composure for arrogance. Oh, don't worry. You'll have your chance. His voice turned official. You're under arrest for possession with intent to distribute. Sullivan moved in to cuff her. Talia didn't resist. As the cold metal snapped around her wrists, she held his gaze, her voice low but firm. You're making a big mistake. For the briefest moment, Sullivan hesitated. But then, with a dismissive scoff, he secured the cuffs. Yeah? We'll see. As Carter led her toward the squad car, he threw one final remark over his shoulder. Let's see how confident you are in front of a judge. Talia gazed out the car window as the city lights blurred past, her mind already formulating her next move. These officers thought they had made an easy arrest. What they didn't know was that they had just walked into the biggest mistake of their careers. The ride to the station was steeped in tension, the silence broken only by the low hum of the engine and the occasional crackle of the police radio. Talia sat in the back seat of the patrol car, her hands secured behind her. The dim glow of passing streetlights flickered across her face, but her expression remained unreadable. Her eyes stayed fixed on the road ahead, while her mind worked like a well-calibrated machine, replaying every moment of the encounter. Every detail clicked into place like pieces of a puzzle. The stop sign that never existed, the officer's overconfidence, the suspiciously placed bag. This wasn't just an abuse of power. It was premeditated, rehearsed. Every action had been intentional. Officer Carter glanced at her in the rearview mirror, his smirk widening as if he had already won. You don't seem too worried, he said, his voice laced with mockery, hoping for a reaction. Talia met his eyes through the mirror, her gaze unwavering. Should I be? She asked calmly. Carter chuckled and shook his head. You're either brave or stupid, lady. I've seen plenty of people put on a tough act, but it never lasts long once they're in holding. She didn't reply. There was no need. She knew his type. Men who thrived on unchecked authority, who bent the rules because they could, who believed they were untouchable. For now, she let him believe he was in control. That illusion wouldn't last much longer. When they arrived at the station, the night shift officers barely looked up from their conversations and coffee cups. The place had the worn-down look of a precinct where things were done a certain way, and no one asked too many questions. Carter and Sullivan led Talia inside, the overhead fluorescent lights casting harsh glares on the scuffed linoleum floor and peeling walls. We got ourselves a big one tonight, Carter announced, his voice loud and arrogant, as if he were presenting a prize catch. Sullivan, relishing the moment, tossed the suspicious bag onto the counter with a smug flick of his wrist. Caught her red-handed, he added. Looks like she's been running more than stop signs. Talia remained silent, her sharp eyes scanning the room, taking in every detail, the placement of cameras, the layout of the desks, the camaraderie among the officers. It was a small station, the kind where favors were exchanged behind closed doors, and truths could be buried deep. At the fingerprinting station, Carter removed the cuffs and motioned for her to place her hands on the ink pad. Talia complied with the same steady composure, her movements unhurried. The officer processing her, a younger man with tired eyes, hesitated for a fraction of a second as if sensing something about her didn't quite add up. "Name?" he asked, his tone softer than expected. "Talia Porter," she responded evenly. "Occupation?" She hesitated for just a moment before offering, "Consultant." It was vague, yet true enough not to raise immediate suspicion. The younger officer nodded, continuing to type, though his unease was apparent. Meanwhile, Carter and Sullivan remained nearby, their smug laughter filling the space as they leaned against the counter, enjoying the spectacle. Talia turned slightly, her voice cutting through their amusement with precision. "And what happens when you frame the wrong person?" The laughter stopped. Both men turned toward her, their cocky expressions faltering for a split second before Carter scoffed. "You've got a smart mouth," he muttered, his tone darkening. "Let's see how funny you are after a night in lockup." The cell was cold, dimly lit, and unwelcoming. A metal bench was bolted to the wall, offering little in the way of comfort. The bars cast long, jagged shadows across the concrete floor, and the fluorescent lights buzzed faintly overhead. Talia sat with her back straight, her posture unwavering. The heavy clang of the cell door echoed through the hallway as it locked behind her. Carter lingered for a moment, watching her through the bars, searching for a crack in her demeanor. He wanted to see fear, to see her break, but all he saw was calm resolve. He had no idea just how much danger he was in. Carter leaned against the cold metal bars, a smirk tugging at the corner of his lips. "You don't seem like the type to get mixed up in this kind of thing," he remarked, his tone almost casual. "But hey, the courts love a good sob story. Maybe they'll go easy on you." Talia didn't flinch. Instead, she tilted her head slightly, her sharp gaze locking on to his. "Or maybe they'll see through yours," she replied, her voice calm but carrying a quiet intensity that made Carter hesitate for just a fraction of a second. He muttered something under his breath and walked away, leaving her alone in the dimly lit cell. She leaned back against the cold metal wall, inhaling slowly. Every move she made now had to be precise. This wasn't just about her freedom. It was about exposing something much bigger. The silence in the cell was broken only by the low hum of the station's HVAC system. She waited, her patience the result of years in the field. Someone would notice her absence soon enough, and when they did, there would be questions. Her team would find her. They always did. Until then, she had a role to play. The calm, cooperative detainee with nothing to hide. But every second in that cell was an opportunity. She listened carefully, mapping out the routine of the night shift officers as they moved past her cell. The shuffle of boots, the muted radio chatter, the faint electronic beeps of the station's computer system. Every sound painted a picture of the environment she was in. When the time came, she would be ready. Meanwhile, in the station's break room, Carter and Sullivan sat back with steaming mugs of coffee, their laughter filling the small space. "She thinks she's untouchable," Sullivan scoffed, shaking his head. "Did you see her face? Not even a flicker of panic." "Yeah, well, that'll change soon enough," Carter replied, amusement playing in his eyes. "She's just another name in the system now. Nobody's going to dig too deep." Sullivan nodded confidently. "Besides, we've got everything we need. The evidence is airtight." Neither of them noticed the younger officer from processing standing nearby. His face was pale, his fingers tightening around his coffee cup. Something about the whole situation didn't sit right with him. But in a place like this, questioning senior officers wasn't just frowned upon. It was dangerous. Back in her cell, Talia closed her eyes, her breathing steady. The hours passed, but she never slept. She didn't need to. Every passing minute brought her closer to the moment when everything would fall apart. For them. The storm was coming, and she was the eye at its center. A faint sliver of dawn filtered through the narrow, high-placed window of her holding cell, casting a muted glow over the cold concrete walls. A new day was beginning, but Talia hadn't moved from her spot. Sitting upright on the metal bench, her expression unreadable, she listened intently to the station coming to life. The distinct voices of the day shift officers, the measured rhythm of new footsteps, each detail adding to her mental map of the station. A loud buzz signaled the unlocking of the cell block door. Heavy boots echoed down the corridor, but Talia remained still. She didn't have to look up to know who it was. Sullivan appeared at the bars, clipboard in hand, his ever-present smirk plastered across his face. "Morning, sunshine," he greeted, his voice dripping with forced cheerfulness. "Hope you got some rest, though I'm guessing that cot wasn't exactly five-star accommodations." Talia met his gaze but said nothing. Her silence unsettled him more than he cared to admit. He shifted his weight slightly before glancing at the clipboard in his hand. "You've got a bail hearing this afternoon," he said, tapping the paper with his pen. "But between you and me, I wouldn't get your hopes up. Judges around here don't take too kindly to drug traffickers." She tilted her head ever so slightly, her expression unreadable. If Sullivan thought she was worried, he was about to realize just how wrong he was. Talia remained firm, her voice soft but unwavering. Sullivan's smirk wavered for just a fraction of a second before he masked it with indifference. Clearing his throat, he took a step back. "Enjoy your breakfast," he muttered, turning on his heel and walking away. Talia leaned against the wall, watching him disappear down the hallway. The cracks in their confidence were beginning to show, and all she needed was a little more time. At the front desk, Officer James Keller sat at his workstation, his fingers hovering over the keyboard. Fresh out of the academy, young and eager, he had processed dozens of arrests in his short time on the job. But this one didn't sit right. Talia Porter wasn't like any suspect he had ever seen. She wasn't combative. She wasn't afraid. She was calculating, deliberate. And that bag of drugs? It had been too convenient, sitting there in the trunk like a neatly wrapped gift. He knew the unspoken rules. Rookies didn't question senior officers. But something gnawed at him. He glanced up at the surveillance monitors, his gaze settling on the live feed of Talia's cell. She sat still as a statue, her expression unreadable. Keller bit his lip, a flicker of doubt creeping in. While he wrestled with his conscience, Talia made her move. Her hands rested casually in her lap, but her sharp eyes stayed locked on the security camera mounted outside her cell. It was an old model, outdated, likely neglected. She guessed the department didn't spend much on high-end surveillance. She waited until the hallway was empty, then shifted slightly on the bench, her movements smooth and unremarkable. Inside the hem of her jacket, a small, nearly invisible device lay hidden. A standard issue tracker for CIA field operatives. With the slightest pressure of her fingers, she triggered the signal. No words were needed, no explanation. Somewhere her team would receive it, and they would know exactly what to do. Across the station, in the break room, Carter and Sullivan sat with their coffee, laughing over the morning paper. "She's probably sitting in there thinking she's got a chance," Carter mused, shaking his head. "They always do. They always think they can talk their way out of it." Sullivan chuckled. "Yeah, well, she's in for a rude awakening. This case is a slam dunk. We've got the drugs, the arrest report, and no witnesses." He smirked. "Nobody's coming to save her." Carter leaned back in his chair, a satisfied grin spreading across his face. "You know what I love about this job?" he said. "The predictability. You see the same types over and over. They think they're smarter than us, but they never are." Their laughter filled the room, oblivious to the storm already brewing beyond their understanding. Elsewhere, in a quiet, nondescript office, a phone buzzed softly on a desk. A hand reached out to answer it. A calm, authoritative voice on the other end simply stated, "Signal received. Location confirmed. Deploying resources." Back in her cell, Talia leaned her head against the wall, closing her eyes for just a moment. She could almost hear the gears turning, the quiet precision of her team moving into place. Every second that passed brought her closer to the inevitable reckoning. When she opened her eyes again, she smiled faintly. Not a smile of amusement, not of relief, a smile of certainty, because Carter and Sullivan had no idea what was coming. Meanwhile, the station carried on with its usual morning routine. Officers filing reports, answering calls, making small talk over coffee. Business as usual, for everyone, except Talia Porter and the two men who had just made the biggest mistake of their lives. Carter and Sullivan saw Talia's arrest as a personal triumph, a victory they were eager to enjoy. Meanwhile, Talia remained still in her holding cell, composed as ever. Through the bars, she caught glimpses of the station's activity, the occasional passing shadow, bits of conversation, but she stayed focused. She knew when to disappear into the background, to make herself unnoticeable until the exact moment she needed to be seen. Her distress signal had been sent hours earlier, and she had complete faith in her team. However, she also knew they wouldn't rush in recklessly. Timing was everything. In the meantime, she had another objective: planting seeds of doubt. At the front desk, Officer Keller's gaze kept drifting toward the surveillance monitors displaying the holding cells. Talia had barely moved since her arrival, yet something about her unsettled him. It wasn't fear or defiance, both common reactions from detainees, but patience, a quiet, unwavering confidence that seemed out of place for someone accused of drug trafficking. Unable to ignore his unease, Keller pulled up her file on his computer. Her driver's license and home address were standard, but her employment history stood out. There was a noticeable gap, with her most recent job listed simply as independent consultant without any further details. Frowning, Keller minimized the file and glanced toward the break room, where Carter and Sullivan were joking around, enjoying their coffee and donuts. Their carefree attitude made his stomach twist. Against his better judgment, Keller decided to examine the arrest report more closely. Clicking through the digital records, he read through the narrative provided by Carter and Sullivan. Stopped for failing to yield at a marked intersection. Driver exhibited nervous behavior during questioning. Consent to search granted. Controlled substances discovered in the vehicle's trunk. Something wasn't right. Keller had been trained to recognize inconsistencies in reports, and while this one appeared to follow proper procedure, it felt too neat, too rehearsed. As the hours passed, his internal conflict grew. He found himself pacing near the holding cells, glancing at Talia more frequently. Finally, he built up the nerve to approach her. "Miss Porter," he said, stopping just outside the bars. Talia lifted her gaze, her dark eyes sharp and perceptive. "Yes?" Keller hesitated, his hand resting on his belt. I just wanted to ask, did you really consent to the search of your car?" Talia tilted her head slightly, studying him. She saw the uncertainty in his expression, the cracks in his confidence. "What do you think, Officer Keller?" she asked, her tone calm but deliberate. Keller swallowed hard. I'm just doing my job," he said, though his voice wavered. "That's exactly what they're counting on," Talia responded steadily. "Men like Carter and Sullivan rely on people like you to look the other way." Keller's face reddened. He stepped back, mumbling something unintelligible, before retreating down the hallway. But Talia had seen the hesitation in his step, the struggle on his face. The seed of doubt had been planted. Meanwhile, in Arlington, a sleek, black sedan pulled up in front of an unremarkable building. A man in a tailored suit stepped out with deliberate precision, flanked by two agents whose posture exuded professionalism and alertness. "What's the ETA on extraction?" one agent asked as they entered the building. The man checked his watch, his expression unreadable. "We move when she gives the signal. Until then, we watch." Inside a secure operations room, several monitors flickered with live feeds from the police station. One screen displayed Talia, sitting motionless in her cell. Another showed the front desk, where Keller paced anxiously, visibly unsettled. "Looks like the kid is starting to figure things out," one of the agents observed. One of the agents watching the live feed smirked. "He's starting to crack." "Good," the man in the suit replied. "We'll use that when the time is right." Meanwhile, in the break room, Carter leaned back in his chair, sipping his third cup of coffee. "Did you see Keller earlier?" he asked Sullivan. "Looked like he'd seen a ghost." Sullivan chuckled, shaking his head. "He's probably just overthinking things. Fresh out of the academy, they always get jittery during their first big case." "Yeah, well, let's hope he doesn't start asking too many questions," Carter muttered, his tone darkening. Sullivan shrugged dismissively. "Doesn't matter. The evidence is solid, and she has no alibi. Even if he gets curious, there's nothing he can prove." Carter nodded, but for the first time a flicker of doubt crossed his expression. What if Keller's uncertainty spread? As the day stretched on, an almost imperceptible shift in the atmosphere filled the station. Talia could sense it, the rising tension, the unspoken doubt settling in. Her team was watching, waiting for the perfect moment to act. Keller's footsteps echoed down the hallway again, slower this time. He stopped outside her cell, his expression conflicted. "You said they're counting on people like me," he murmured. What did you mean by that? Talia met his gaze steadily. You already know, she said calmly. The question is, what are you going to do about it? Keller held her stare for a long moment before turning away, his shoulders tense as he walked off. In the operations room, the man in the suit watched Keller's retreat on the monitors, a small smile playing at the corner of his lips. He's close, he murmured. One of the agents glanced at him. The smile widened. One more push, the man said. Then we flip this whole thing upside down. At his desk, Keller drummed his fingers against the edge. His eyes locked on Talia Porter's digital file. The words blurred as his thoughts churned. That uneasy feeling in his gut, the one that had been growing since the arrest, was now impossible to ignore. His gaze flickered toward the break room, where Carter and Sullivan were still joking around, oblivious to his turmoil. Their laughter grated on him. The station felt different today, heavier, as if the walls themselves were holding a secret. His mind kept replaying Talia's words. That's what they're counting on. She had spoken with such certainty, as if she knew exactly how to get under his skin. Maybe she did, but was she wrong? As the hours dragged on, Keller's unease hardened into quiet determination. He needed answers, but drawing too much attention to himself was risky. As a rookie, he was already a target for teasing. If he stepped out of line, he could be completely isolated. He waited until Carter and Sullivan left the room before slipping into the records archive. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting long shadows across the filing cabinets and computer stations. Logging into the system, Keller's hands trembled slightly as he searched for past cases linked to Carter and Sullivan. The results sent a chill down his spine. Their names appeared again and again, always connected to arrests that followed a troublingly similar pattern. Minor traffic stops escalating into drug charges. Most of the defendants were people of color. Most were convicted. The knot in his chest tightened. Back in her cell, Talia remained perfectly still, her body composed, her mind sharp. She had spent years training for moments like this, where patience was crucial and the stakes were high. Through the bars, she saw Keller pass her cell again, his pacing slower now, his steps more deliberate. She could feel the internal battle raging inside him. He was close to breaking the cycle of blind obedience that men like Carter and Sullivan depended on. She shifted slightly on the bench, just enough to catch his attention, making him stop. She turned to face him, her voice calm yet commanding. Officer Keller. He hesitated, gripping the edge of the wall as if it could steady him. What? He asked, his tone low and defensive. You've seen something, haven't you? She said, tilting her head slightly. Something that doesn't add up. Keller swallowed hard. I can't. He stopped himself, his voice faltering. I'm just trying to do my job. And what exactly is your job? Talia pressed. To follow orders? To look the other way when you know something isn't right? Keller's jaw clenched, his eyes darting down the hallway. You don't understand how things work around here. Talia's gaze remained steady. I understand more than you think, she replied. I know what it feels like to be trapped, to believe you don't have a choice. But you do, Keller. You always have a choice. Keller turned and walked away, but her words stayed with him like a shadow. Back at his desk, he stared at his computer screen, his fingers hovering over the keyboard. The list of cases linked to Carter and Sullivan remained open, each name making the knot in his stomach tighten. Then finally he made his decision. Opening a secure email channel, he began to type. His fingers moved faster with each passing second, his hesitation fading into determination. He attached the files he had found and added a brief message. To whom it may concern, there's something wrong in this station. I don't know who else to turn to. Please help. He hit send. His heart pounded as the message disappeared into the void. He didn't know who would receive it or if they would even care, but he had taken the first step toward doing what was right. In the break room, Carter leaned back in his chair, lazily resting his coffee cup on his knee. You notice Keller acting weird today? He asked, glancing at Sullivan. Sullivan shrugged. Kid's always weird. What's he gonna do, rat us out? Carter smirked, but his eyes darkened slightly. Still, keep an eye on him. Last thing we need is some rookie sticking his nose where it doesn't belong. That afternoon, a sleek black sedan pulled into the station's parking lot. Inside, Talia's team was making their final preparations. They had intercepted Keller's email, exactly as planned. Now they had everything they needed to move forward. "Let's keep this clean," the team leader said, adjusting his tie. "No unnecessary disruptions. We expose this from the inside." As they stepped out of the vehicle, the sunlight reflected off their badges. FBI. Inside her cell, Talia allowed herself a faint smile as she heard the station doors swing open. She couldn't see them from her vantage point, but she didn't need to. Her team had arrived. The storm wasn't brewing anymore. It was here. The usual hum of the station fell into an uneasy silence as the agents entered. Their movements were controlled, their suits crisp, their badges gleaming under the fluorescent lights. At his desk, Keller froze mid-typing, his pulse accelerating. He wasn't sure if the feeling gripping him was fear, relief, or both. The lead agent, a tall man with graying hair and a stern expression, strode to the front desk. His sharp eyes swept over the room, assessing everything in an instant. Keller watched as the agent leaned in slightly, speaking low enough that surrounding officers couldn't overhear. The desk sergeant, a burly man with a gruff demeanor, straightened up, his hand instinctively drifting toward his radio. "What's this about?" he asked, his voice cautious. The agent's response was clipped and steady. "Federal investigation. We need access to your records and holding cells immediately." The sergeant hesitated, furrowing his brow as he exchanged a glance with another officer. The FBI's sudden arrival was unexpected, disruptive, but there was no protocol for saying no. "Fine," he muttered, gesturing toward the hallway. "Follow me." From his desk, Keller watched. His hands were slick with sweat. Deep down, he knew. The email he had sent had set all of this in motion. But he never expected a response so swift, so undeniable. Keller's gaze flicked toward Carter and Sullivan, lingering near the break room door. Their laughter had faded, replaced by hushed whispers and tense expressions. For a split second, Carter's piercing eyes locked onto his. Keller quickly averted his gaze, pretending to focus on his screen. The atmosphere in the station had changed. The air was thick, suffocating, charged with an unspoken tension. And then, they arrived. Agent Daniel Price, the lead investigator, stepped into a dimly lit interrogation room with his team. A second agent followed, pushing a cart loaded with a portable server and several hard drives. They didn't waste a second. With practiced precision, they plugged into the station's network and began to sift through its digital archives. Leaning against the wall, arms crossed, Price watched as lines of code and file names raced across the monitor. "Did you find anything?" he asked. The tech agent, a sharp-eyed woman, barely hesitated. "Plenty. The case files are full of inconsistencies. Same arrest patterns, identical narratives, missing procedural steps. This isn't just bad policing. It's a system." Price's expression darkened. "Pull everything. I want every report, every record, every piece of evidence tied to them." Meanwhile, in her cell, Talia felt it. The shift, the ripple. Her team was here. The waiting was almost over. She shifted slightly on the bench, her hands resting loosely on her lap. The faint red marks from the cuffs on her wrists didn't matter. Her focus was locked on what came next. The moment when the truth could no longer be buried. Across the station, Carter paced, his forgotten coffee growing cold on the counter. Sullivan leaned against the wall, arms crossed, studying his partner's agitation. "You think this is about her?" Sullivan finally asked, voice low. Carter stopped, his glare sharp. "Of course it's about her. Why else would the feds be here?" Sullivan hesitated. "You think they know?" Carter scoffed, but something was missing in his voice. Confidence. Certainty. "Know what?" "There's nothing to know. We did everything by the book," Sullivan muttered under his breath. "Sure." The break room door creaked open. Agent Price emerged, flanked by two agents. In his hands, a thick folder of printed reports. Physical proof of something bigger than any of them had realized. He moved with purpose, navigating through the station until his eyes landed on his targets. "Officers Brandon Carter and Mark Sullivan." His voice sliced through the air like a blade. "We need to speak with you." Carter forced a smirk, stepping forward as if unbothered. "What's this about?" he asked, his tone almost casual. "We've got nothing to hide." Price didn't blink. "Good. Then you won't mind answering a few questions? The room fell silent. All eyes watched as the agents escorted Carter and Sullivan down the hallway toward the same interrogation room that, just moments ago, had been occupied by the investigators. Keller's pulse pounded in his ears as he observed the shift. He could see it now, the cracks forming in Carter's once impenetrable exterior, the rigid tension in Sullivan's shoulders. The two officers, once so sure of themselves, now looked more like cornered animals. And then another door buzzed open. An agent stepped into Talia's cell, his expression neutral, his voice steady. "Miss Porter," he said, "you're free to go." Talia rose with quiet confidence, her movements smooth, controlled. As she stepped out of the cell, she met the agent's gaze, giving a subtle nod before walking toward the front desk. And as she passed Keller's desk, their eyes met for a brief, electrifying moment. He opened his mouth to speak. But what could he say? Because in that moment, one thing was certain: nothing would ever be the same again. Keller hesitated. Words formed in his mind but never made it past his lips. She stopped, turned, faced him fully. "Thank you," Talia said, her voice quiet yet heavy with meaning. Keller's chest tightened. He gave a small nod, his hands gripping the edge of his desk. He didn't know what the future held, but for the first time since joining the force, he felt like he had done something that truly mattered. Across the station, the interrogation room doors shut behind Carter and Sullivan. Moments later, raised voices echoed through the hall. From the entrance, Talia watched. The agents moved with precision, unraveling the officers' carefully constructed lies. The storm had arrived, and this was only the beginning. Inside the cramped interrogation room, Carter and Sullivan sat stiffly at a cold metal table. Agent Price stood opposite them, his hands resting on a thick stack of documents. The silence stretched. Only the faint hum of the overhead light filled the space. Price finally spoke, his voice calm but firm. "So, do you want to start with the arrest report, or should we jump straight to the planted evidence?" Sullivan flinched, his eyes darting toward Carter. "We don't know what you're talking about," Carter replied, his tone defiant. Price didn't flinch. Instead, he opened the folder and pulled out a series of photographs. One by one, he slid them across the table. Security camera footage, clear as day, Carter and Sullivan handling an unmarked bag. Moments before Talia's car was searched. Carter's jaw tightened, but he held his composure. "That doesn't prove anything," he said. "We were securing evidence." Price arched an eyebrow, leaning in slightly. "Really?" "Because these timestamps say otherwise. And then there's the audio." He let the words hang in the air, watching the shift in their expressions. "Courtesy of Miss Porter's hidden surveillance device," he continued, "which captured your little conversation about how easy it would be to frame her." Sullivan went pale. His hands gripped the edge of the table. You can't use that," he sputtered. "That's entrapment." Price smirked, shaking his head. That's justice, and it's just the tip of the iceberg." He dropped another folder onto the table. "We've reviewed your past arrests, dozens of cases with eerily similar patterns. All of them are under scrutiny now. But let me make one thing perfectly clear." His voice hardened. "You're not walking out of here today." Carter's bravado cracked. His shoulders sagged. Sullivan let out a shaky breath and buried his face in his hands. In the bullpen, Keller sat at his desk, watching it all unfold. He had already been called in once to confirm details about the station's internal procedures. Now, for the first time, Carter and Sullivan looked at him differently. Recognition, betrayal, realization. Someone from within had spoken out. As the agents returned to the main office, Keller stood. His hands trembled slightly, but he took a deep breath and stepped forward. He cleared his throat. "What happens now?" he asked. Price studied him for a moment, his expression softening just a fraction. "Now," he said, "now we clean house." A pause. Then with something close to approval, he added, "And you did the right thing." Relief washed over Keller, quiet but profound. For the first time in his career, he felt like he had a purpose. Near the entrance, Talia stood motionless, watching. Carter and Sullivan, once untouchable, once smug, were led out in handcuffs, their faces drained of arrogance, their eyes fixed on the ground as they passed their fellow officers. A murmur spread through the station. Whispers, stolen glances, the weight of the moment sinking in. Agent Price approached Talia. His tone was neutral, but there was a quiet respect behind his words. "We've got everything we need," he said. "Your work here is done." Talia held his gaze, her composure unwavering. "Good," she said. "Make sure it sticks." Price gave the faintest smile. "It will." Talia stepped outside. The crisp air hit her skin, carrying with it the weight of finality. For weeks she had carried this burden. Now at last, it was lifting. Justice had finally prevailed, but the shock waves were only beginning. In the days following the investigation, the town was shaken to its core. Carter and Sullivan's arrest dominated the news, their faces displayed on every screen, the headlines relentless in exposing their crimes. Meanwhile, the charges against Talia were officially dropped, and cases linked to the officers' corruption were reopened. The police station itself was in turmoil. A massive internal shakeup led to multiple resignations as officers came under scrutiny. Keller, now seen as a whistleblower, found himself at the center of controversy. Some of his colleagues distanced themselves, while others quietly respected his courage. But Keller didn't waver. He knew he had done the right thing. Weeks later, on a crisp autumn morning, Talia sat alone on a park bench, a warm cup of coffee in her hands. The wind stirred the fallen leaves around her, a quiet reminder that change was inevitable. Her mission was complete, but the weight of it still lingered. Agent Price approached, his presence rare outside of official business. He took a seat beside her, his gaze steady. "You could have handled this differently," he remarked. Talia smirked, taking a slow sip of coffee. "And miss the look on their faces?" "No thanks." Price let out a quiet chuckle. "You certainly have a way of making things memorable." For a moment they sat in silence, the usual burdens of their work momentarily set aside. The storm had passed, but Talia knew the impact of her actions would ripple far beyond this moment, ensuring that justice endured, at least for now. The scandal spread like wildfire. Within hours of Carter and Sullivan's arrest, news outlets, both local and national, picked up the story. "Police corruption exposed. FBI takes down dirty cops in Arlington." The footage played on repeat. Carter and Sullivan, once untouchable, now led away in handcuffs. Gone was the arrogance they had once carried so boldly. Talia's name, however, was nowhere to be found. Her team had ensured that. The focus needed to remain on the corruption within the department, not on the operative who had uncovered it, and that was exactly how she wanted it. She wasn't in this for recognition, only for results. In a stark, windowless interrogation room at a federal detention center, Carter and Sullivan sat across from their attorneys. The arrogance they had once displayed had been replaced with sheer desperation. The evidence against them was overwhelming. Falsified reports, planted evidence, abuse of authority in case after case. There was no way out. "This is bad," Sullivan muttered, his voice unsteady. "They've got everything. Audio, video, files. What do we do?" Carter, usually the one brimming with confidence, clenched his jaw. "We fight it," he said at last. But the weakness in his voice betrayed him. Their lawyers, however, weren't as delusional. The sheer weight of the evidence, combined with the public outrage, had tipped the scales irreversibly against them. Their only hope of avoiding decades in prison was a plea bargain. Back at the Arlington Police Department, the fallout continued. Internal investigations uncovered more officers involved in similar practices. Resignations piled up as those in power scrambled to distance themselves from the scandal. The chief of police held a press conference vowing transparency and reform, but the damage to the department's reputation was done. No matter how much they tried to clean up the mess, the stain of corruption wouldn't fade easily. Keller found himself in an unusual position. Some praised him for exposing the truth, while others treated him like a traitor. Old loyalties ran deep, and not everyone was ready to embrace change. Some colleagues avoided him entirely, while a few, in hushed tones, expressed their quiet support. But Keller wasn't looking for validation. He had made his choice. He had done the right thing, and that was enough. A week after her release, Talia met Keller at a small diner on the edge of town. The contrast was striking. The peaceful atmosphere of the cafe clashed with the turmoil they had endured. Keller, sitting across from her, nervously toyed with his coffee cup. I wasn't sure you'd come, he admitted, his voice subdued. Talia arched an eyebrow, a knowing smirk playing on her lips. You earned this conversation, she said. Not many would have had the guts to do what you did. Keller sighed, staring down at the table. I just couldn't turn a blind eye anymore. But sometimes I wonder, did it even matter? The department's still a disaster. And for every Carter and Sullivan, there are more like them out there. Talia's gaze was steady. It mattered to the people they hurt, she said, and it mattered to you. Don't underestimate that. For the first time in weeks, Keller let out a breath that didn't feel heavy. A small, almost reluctant smile crossed his face. What about you? He asked. What happens now? Talia leaned back, her expression unreadable. Now? I move on to the next mission. There's always another fight. Months later, the final chapter of this scandal played out in the courtroom. Carter and Sullivan, once so confident in their invincibility, now stood before a judge, their fates no longer in their hands. The evidence against them was overwhelming. In the end, they had no choice but to plead guilty. Their sentences were severe, their careers destroyed, their reputations shattered. But justice wasn't just about punishing the guilty. It was about restoring what had been lost. The false convictions they had orchestrated were overturned. Innocent people, once condemned by their lies, were finally exonerated. The community, once broken by corruption, now stood together, demanding real change. Meanwhile, in a quiet, sparsely furnished apartment, Talia packed a small bag. On the table lay a dossier filled with details of her next mission. She glanced at it briefly before closing it. Her mind was already set on the road ahead. Her phone buzzed. She picked it up. Agent Price's voice came through the line. Ready for the next one? A faint smile touched her lips. Always. As she stepped outside, the crisp evening air wrapped around her. Behind her, the door clicked shut. The fight wasn't over. Not for her, not for the people she had sworn to protect. But for now, she allowed herself a brief moment of satisfaction. Justice had been served. The truth had prevailed. And that, for her, was enough. This story is a reminder that no matter how deep the corruption, no matter how powerful the lies, the truth will always find a way to the surface. Justice is not always immediate, but it is inevitable. If you found this story compelling and want to hear more thrilling tales, make sure to turn on notifications so you never miss a new one. Your support is invaluable and helps bring these stories to life. Thanks for watching, and see you in the next one.